A mountain man ordered a teen bride, but a 70-year-old woman stepped off the wagon. Snow drifts across a dusty street. The church bell tolls. Every eye in town stares as the wagon door creaks open, and instead of a young bride, an old widow stands tall, silver hair gleaming beneath her bonnet. The mountain man's face burns with shame. Whispers spread like wildfire. He ordered a child, and got a grandmother. But what begins as a cruel joke hides a truth more dangerous than anyone imagined. Behind the woman's calm eyes lies a secret about land, family, and a railroad willing to do anything to take it. Chains rattle, jail doors slam, and thundering hooves echo across the frozen night as lies tighten their grip. She may be frail in body, but she carries the fire of faith and the courage to stand when no one else will. Can one mountain man and one 70-year-old woman defy greed, survive the winter, and prove that God himself chose the bride no one expected? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. Under a pewter sky heavy with snow, Wesley McCrae hunched over the iron stove in his mountain cabin, feeding kindling to a struggling flame. The wood caught with a crackle, sending a blessed wave of warmth through the one-room shelter he'd built with his own hands 15 years ago. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs, carrying winter's first real bite. His joints ached as he straightened, reminding him that 50 years had left their mark. The cabin walls held the silence of another solitary evening, broken only by the pop of burning wood and his own breathing. Wesley's gaze drifted to the rough-hewn table where he'd penned that letter 6 weeks back, his normally steady hand shaking as he'd written to the marriage bureau in Denver, seeking Christian woman willing to share frontier life, can offer modest home, honest work, and faithful partnership. The words had cost him dear pride to write. Now they haunted him through the lengthening nights as he waited for reply. A familiar nickering drew his attention to the window. Through the gathering dusk, he could make out Blaze in the corral, the bay gelding's breath steaming in the cold air. The horse stood alert, ears pricked toward the trail that wound down from the high passes. Wesley found himself doing the same lately, watching that trail, wondering, would she really come? Some young woman he'd never laid eyes on, willing to bind her life to an aging mountain man? The thought sent an uneasy shiver through him that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. He pulled his wool coat tighter and stepped out onto the porch, boots crunching in the thin crust of early snow. The mountains loomed dark against the graying sky, peaks already frosted white. Another winter closing in, same as always. But maybe not so lonely this time. Wesley shook his head at his own foolishness. Better to tend to what needed doing than stand wool gathering. He grabbed his empty canteen and headed for town to resupply, though he'd rather avoid the knowing looks and whispered comments he was sure to face. The 5-mile ride to Silver Creek took longer than usual with the weather turning. By the time Wesley tied Blaze outside Murdoch's Mercantile, early snowflakes were starting to swirl. The bell above the door announced his entrance with a cheerful jingle that seemed at odds with the hushed conversation that died as he stepped inside. Martha Murdoch stood behind the counter, her round face flushed as she quickly found something to organize among her shelves. Her husband Thomas emerged from the back room, nodding stiffly in Wesley's direction. "McCrae," he said, while 2 ranch hands near the pot-bellied stove suddenly became very interested in examining the tobacco supplies. Wesley touched the brim of his hat in greeting, keeping his eyes on the items he needed. Coffee, flour, salt, pork. He could feel the weight of unspoken words in the air, thick as the storm clouds outside. "Heard you might be expecting company soon," Martha finally ventured, unable to contain herself as she wrapped his purchases in brown paper. "Might be," Wesley answered shortly, counting out coins on the counter. One of the ranch hands by the stove cleared his throat. "Mighty young company from what I hear tell. Ain't right for a man your age to be sending away for some green girl, McCrae." Wesley's hands stilled on the coins. He turned slowly, fixing the younger man with a steady look that had sent more than one troublemaker backing down over the years. "Reckon that's between me and the Lord, Burns. And the poor child's family," Martha added with a sniff. "If she has any worth speaking of, letting her come out here alone." Wesley gathered his supplies without another word, though his ears burned at the truth in their words. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, thick flakes catching in his graying beard as he secured his purchases to Blaze's saddle. He'd nearly reached the edge of town when young Jimmy from the telegraph office came running after him, waving a yellow paper. "Mr. McCrae, wait up, sir. Message came for you." Wesley's heart gave an uncomfortable lurch as he took the telegram with fingers that felt suddenly clumsy. The boy waited, bouncing on his toes, clearly hoping to see his reaction to whatever news the paper held. "Much obliged," Wesley said gruffly, tucking the unopened message into his coat pocket. He turned Blaze toward home, aware of Jimmy's disappointed slump as he rode away. Only when the town was hidden behind the falling snow did Wesley pull his horse to a halt under a sheltering pine. His hands shook slightly as he withdrew the telegram and unfolded it in the failing light. "Wagon arrives tomorrow, stop 9 am sharp, Silver Creek Station, stop 1 passenger for McCrae Homestead, stop." The words burned themselves into his brain. Tomorrow. She was really coming tomorrow. Wesley sat motionless in the saddle while snow gathered on his shoulders, the reality of what he'd set in motion finally hitting home. Blaze shifted restlessly, bringing him back to himself. The temperature was dropping fast now, and they had miles yet to ride. Wesley tucked the telegram safely away and urged his horse forward into the gathering storm. The cabin was dark and cold when they arrived. Wesley took extra care with Blaze, making sure the horse was thoroughly rubbed down and well supplied with hay before heading inside. The familiar motions of lighting the lamps and rebuilding the fire couldn't quiet the thoughts whirling through his mind. He went through the motions of preparing a simple supper, beans and salt pork warming on the stove, coffee brewing in the battered pot, cornbread from yesterday's baking. The food might as well have been sawdust for all he tasted it. Tomorrow a young woman would arrive, expecting what? A proper home? A gentle husband? All he had to offer was this rough cabin, calloused hands, and a heart grown harder than it should be through years of solitude. Wesley pushed his half-eaten supper aside and paced the cabin's length. 7 steps one way, 7 steps back. The walls seemed to press in closer than usual tonight. Finally, he did something he hadn't done proper in longer than he cared to remember. Lowering himself to his knees beside the narrow bed, Wesley bowed his head. "Lord." The word came out rough, unpracticed. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Lord, I ain't much for praying, as you well know, but I reckon I need some guidance here." The wind moaned around the cabin corners as if in answer. Wesley shifted uncomfortably on his knees. "If I've done a foolish thing, writing to that marriage bureau, if I'm fixing to bring harm or hardship to some innocent girl." He paused, searching for words. "Well, I guess what I'm asking is this your will? Or just an old man's selfish notion?" "No." Divine answer came. Only the steady tick of snow against the window panes and the crackle of the fire. After a while, Wesley climbed stiffly to his feet, his knees protesting the unusual position. He banked the fire for the night and blew out the lamp, but sleep was slow in coming. He lay in the darkness, listening to the storm's fury growing outside, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The last thought that crossed his mind before exhaustion finally claimed him was a familiar verse his mother used to quote, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding." The wind continued to howl through the Colorado night, carrying the promise of change on its bitter breath. The pale winter sun had barely cleared the mountain peaks when Wesley McCrae led Blaze from the barn. Frost sparkled on fence posts and brittle grass, the morning air sharp enough to steal his breath. He'd spent more time than usual on his appearance, trimming his beard, pressing his best shirt, polishing his worn boots. Still, the mirror had shown him what he'd rather not see. A weathered man well past his prime, about to make a fool of himself in front of the whole town. The 5-mile ride into Silver Creek seemed shorter than usual, his stomach churning with each hoofbeat. As he approached the main street, Wesley noticed an unusual number of people milling about for such an early hour. Seemed the whole town had turned out for the spectacle. Martha Murdoch stood in front of her store, hands planted firmly on her broad hips. The widow Jenkins and her sewing circle huddled nearby, their heads bent together like roosting hens. Even Sheriff Taylor had emerged from his office, thumbs hooked in his gun belt as he watched Wesley ride past. "Fine morning for a wedding, McCrae," someone called out, followed by poorly concealed snickers. Wesley kept his eyes forward, guiding Blaze toward the stage depot. A group of children darted between the buildings, pointing and giggling. Their mothers made half-hearted attempts to hush them, but Wesley could hear their own whispered judgments clear enough. "Shameful business. ordering a child bride. Never thought Wesley McCrae would stoop so low. Poor little thing, coming all this way. He dismounted stiffly in front of the depot, his joints protesting the cold. The station master, old Pete Wilson, gave him a disapproving nod as Wesley tied Blaze to the hitching post. "Stage is running on time today," Pete announced to the growing crowd. "Should be here any minute now." Wesley's hands trembled slightly as he straightened his coat. The crowd had swelled to nearly 50 people, ranchers, shopkeepers, miners, and their families. Men tipped their hats with exaggerated courtesy as they passed, smirking behind their hands. Wesley had never felt more exposed, standing there like a prize bull at auction. A distant whistle cut through the morning air. Heads turned toward the sound, and the murmuring grew louder. Wesley's heart hammered against his ribs as the stage rounded the bend, 4 horses straining against their traces as wheels clattered over the hard-packed dirt. The driver, Jake Murphy, pulled back on the reins, bringing the stage to a stop in a cloud of dust and steam. The crowd pressed closer, necks craning to catch the first glimpse of Wesley's young bride. Wesley wiped his palms against his trousers and stepped forward as Jake secured the brake. The side door creaked open slowly, and Wesley held his breath, dreading the sight of some terrified young girl. Instead, a wooden cane appeared, followed by a tall figure in a neat gray traveling dress. Silver hair peeked out from beneath a modest bonnet, and clear blue eyes surveyed the crowd with quiet dignity. The woman had to be at least 70 years old, yet she held herself straight and proud despite the cane she leaned upon. Wesley heard gasps and surprised mutters from the onlookers. His own mouth fell open as the elderly woman made her way carefully down the steps, refusing Jake's offered hand with a polite shake of her head. "I manage quite well on my own. Thank you kindly," she said, her voice strong and clear. Wesley found his voice at last, though it came out rougher than he intended. "Ma'am, there must be some mistake. I'm Wesley McCrae, and you're expecting my granddaughter Sarah," the woman finished for him. "I'm Eloise Carver, and I'm afraid Sarah won't be coming." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded paper. "However, I've signed the contract in her place. Everything is quite legal and binding." Wesley's face burned as titters of laughter rippled through the crowd. He snatched the paper from her hand, scanning the neat script with growing dismay. Sure enough, her signature was there, witnessed and notarized proper. "This ain't right," he growled. "I didn't send for no." He bit off the words, aware of how many ears were straining to catch every syllable. Eloise Carver regarded him steadily, seemingly unruffled by his anger or the crowd's amusement. "God sent me where I was needed, Mr. McCrae. Now, shall we discuss this further in private, or would you prefer to continue entertaining the good people of Silver Creek?" Someone in the crowd guffawed openly at that, and Wesley's embarrassment turned to fury. He started to crumple the contract, then thought better of it as Eloise's eyebrow rose slightly. "Jake," Wesley called to the driver, "get Mrs. Carver's trunk down. We'll be heading home straight away." He turned back to Eloise, keeping his voice low. "This ain't settled, ma'am, not by a long shot." "Few things worth doing are settled easily," she replied, calmly. "I'll need a moment to thank Reverend Stevens for his company during the journey." She nodded toward a distinguished-looking gentleman who had just stepped down from the stage. The Reverend tipped his hat to Wesley. "A pleasure to travel with your intended, Mr. McCrae." Mrs. Carver's knowledge of scripture and hymns made the journey most edifying. Wesley's jaw clenched as fresh laughter bubbled up from the onlookers. Martha Murdoch had pressed her handkerchief to her mouth, shoulders shaking with barely suppressed mirth. Even Sheriff Taylor was fighting a smile. Jake heaved a solid trunk from the stage's boot, settling it with a thump in the back of Wesley's wagon. Eloise spoke quietly with the Reverend for a moment, then made her way to where Wesley waited. Several of the town's more prominent citizens stepped forward, unable to resist the chance to witness Wesley's discomfort up close. "Welcome to Silver Creek, Mrs. Carver," Martha Murdoch said, her eyes dancing with amusement. "I do hope you'll join our Thursday quilting circle. We so enjoy fresh perspectives." "How kind," Eloise replied. "I look forward to getting to know everyone properly." She turned to Wesley. "Shall we, Mr. McCrae? I expect you're eager to show me my new home." Wesley helped her into the wagon with stiff courtesy, acutely aware of the dozens of eyes watching their every move. As he untied Blaze's reins, he heard the Widow Jenkins' stage whisper, "Well, she certainly has presence, you must admit." More presents than poor Wesley bargained for, I'd say, someone replied, setting off another round of laughter. Wesley swung into the saddle, his face burning. "This way, Mrs. Carver," he said shortly, nudging Blaze forward. As they left town behind, Wesley could still hear the buzz of excited conversation. By sunset, every soul in 3 counties would know how Wesley McCrae's mail-order bride turned out to be an elderly widow instead of the young girl he'd expected. He wasn't sure he'd ever live down the shame of it. He glanced back at the wagon where Eloise sat straight and serene, apparently unbothered by the rough road or the awkward situation. She caught his eye and offered a small smile. "I know this isn't what you expected, Mr. McCrae," she said, "but I've found the Lord often works in unexpected ways." Wesley turned back to the trail without responding. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the frost-covered ground, his on horseback, hers in the wagon stretching ahead toward his cabin and whatever complications this strange turn of events would bring. Behind them, the town of Silver Creek buzzed like an overturned beehive with the most exciting news it had seen in years. The honorable men shook their heads at the spectacle, while their wives already planned calls to visit Wesley's unusual bride. And through it all, the mountains looked down unchanged, keeping their own counsel about this latest drama playing out in their shadow. Wesley yanked Blaze's reins hard and spurred him away from the crowd, leaving Eloise standing alone in the dusty street. His anger burned hot as winter wind whipped at his coat. Let her find her own way back east. He hadn't asked for this mockery. "Mr. McCrae," Martha Dillard's sharp voice cut through the morning air. "You come right back here this instant." Wesley pulled Blaze to a halt but didn't turn around. The plump storekeeper had hurried to Eloise's side, her usually cheerful face stern with disapproval. "You cannot leave a lady stranded in the street," Martha continued, one hand on her hip. "It isn't Christian, and it isn't decent." Several townsfolk murmured in agreement. Wesley's shoulders tensed as he felt their judgment weighing on him. He might be a mountain man, but his mama had raised him better than this. Martha guided Eloise toward the general store's covered porch. "Come along, dear. We'll get you settled while Mr. McCrae remembers his manners." Eloise allowed herself to be led, though her spine remained straight as a lodgepole pine. "Much obliged, Mrs. Dillard. I don't want to impose." "Nonsense," Martha said firmly. "Tom," she called to her husband, "help bring Mrs. Carver's trunk inside before it starts snowing again." Wesley sat motionless on Blaze, pride warring with shame. Behind him, he could hear the scrape of the heavy trunk being moved, the quiet murmur of women's voices, the shuffling of curious onlookers. "A man owns up to his obligations," Sheriff Taylor said quietly as he passed by. "Even the unexpected ones." The words struck home like a well-aimed arrow. Wesley remembered his own father's teachings about honor and duty. With a muttered curse, he wheeled Blaze around and rode back to the store. Martha's face softened when she saw him return. "There's coffee brewing inside," she offered. "Perhaps you two should talk before heading up to the cabin." Wesley shook his head. "Storm's coming. Need to get home before it hits." He dismounted and approached Eloise, who stood calmly watching him. "Ma'am, if you still want to come, I'll take you up to the cabin. Can't promise it'll work out, but you deserve a proper chance at least." "That's all I ask," Eloise replied simply. She turned to Martha. "Thank you for your kindness, Mrs. Dillard. I hope we'll meet again soon." Tom Dillard and Wesley loaded the trunk into Wesley's wagon. Martha pressed a paper-wrapped package into Eloise's hands. "Just some fresh bread and preserves," she said. "The cabin's a fair piece up the mountain." Wesley helped Eloise into the wagon seat, then mounted Blaze. The crowd had thinned, but those remaining watched with obvious interest as they set off toward the mountain trail. The first mile passed in frosty silence. Wesley rode slightly ahead, his back rigid. Behind him, Eloise began humming softly, an old hymn he half remembered from childhood. "What a friend we have in Jesus," drifted forward on the cold air. "The mountains are glorious," Eloise commented during a pause in her humming. "Like God's own cathedral." Wesley grunted noncommittally, but found his eyes tracking the familiar peaks with fresh awareness. The afternoon sun caught the snow-dusted crags, painting them gold and rose. He'd stopped noticing their beauty years ago. "Looks like snow coming," he said gruffly, gesturing at the heavy clouds building in the west. "Yes," Eloise agreed. "The air has that feeling. My joints can sense it too." She resumed humming, this time, "Amazing Grace." Wesley's hands tightened on the reins. The woman's calm acceptance of the situation unsettled him more than anger would have. He'd expected tears, accusations, demands. Not this steady presence and gentle hymns. They climbed higher as the short winter day waned. Blaze picked his way carefully along the narrowing trail, the wagon creaking behind. Wesley found himself listening for Eloise's humming, tension growing when it occasionally stopped. "You doing all right back there?" he called during one such silence. "Quite well, thank you," came the measured response. "Though I imagine we're both ready for supper and a warm fire." Wesley nodded, relief mixing with his lingering resentment. At least she wasn't complaining about the rough journey. Dusk was falling as they finally reached the cabin. Smoke curled from the chimney. He'd banked the morning's fire well. The small log structure squatted against the mountainside, dark windows reflecting the last light. Wesley helped Eloise down from the wagon, noting how she leaned more heavily on her cane after the long ride. He led her to the cabin door, suddenly aware of every flaw in his bachelor dwelling. The interior was dim and cold despite the banked fire. Unwashed breakfast dishes cluttered the table. Dust coated every surface, and the floor needed sweeping. His spare shirts hung from pegs, and his rifle rested above the mantel. The single room smelled of wood smoke, unwashed wool, and solitude. Eloise took it all in with a quick glance. Without comment, she removed her bonnet and shawl, hanging them neatly by the door. "I'll just freshen up a bit, then see about supper," she said. "Would you be kind enough to bring in my trunk, and perhaps add wood to the fire?" Wesley found himself obeying before he'd consciously decided to do so. By the time he'd hauled in the trunk and built up the fire, Eloise had tied on an apron and was unpacking her basket of provisions. "Mrs. Dillard's bread will go nicely with the stew I planned," she said, pulling out packets and jars. "I brought dried beef, vegetables, and seasonings. Where do you keep your cooking pot?" Wesley pointed to the shelf near the hearth, then stood awkwardly, unsure of his role in this domestic invasion. "Sit down, Mr. McCrae," Eloise said firmly. "You've had a trying day, and this won't take long." He settled into his usual chair, watching as she efficiently assembled ingredients. Soon, savory smells filled the cabin. Eloise moved between fire and table with surprising grace despite her cane, humming softly as she worked. The stew, when served, was the best meal Wesley had eaten in years. The meat was tender, the broth rich with herbs he couldn't name. Fresh bread and apple preserves completed the simple feast. "This is good eating," he admitted grudgingly, scraping his bowl clean. "Been a while since I had proper cooking." "Food tastes better shared," Eloise replied. She rose and began gathering dishes. "Now, you've had a long day. Why don't you see to your evening chores while I clean up here?" Wesley escaped gratefully to the barn, where he spent extra time caring for Blaze and the 2 milk cows. When he could delay no longer, he returned to find the cabin transformed. Dishes were washed and put away. The table had been scrubbed, the floor swept, a colorful quilt lay folded at the foot of his narrow bunk, and a lamp burned cheerfully on the table. Eloise sat in the room's other chair, knitting needles clicking softly in the firelight. "I've made up the bunk with fresh linens," she said without looking up. "You'll find your blankets by the hearth." Wesley opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Of course, she'd take the bunk. He couldn't make an author. Elderly women sleep on the floor, no matter how irregular their situation. He arranged his blankets near the fire, hyper-aware of Eloise's presence as he removed his boots. The familiar cabin felt strange, as if it had shifted slightly off-center. Everything was cleaner, warmer, less lonely, and completely unsettling. "Good night, Mr. McCrae," Eloise said, setting aside her knitting. "We can discuss arrangements properly tomorrow." Wesley grunted an acknowledgement and lay down, staring at the fire's dance across the log walls. Behind him, he heard Eloise's quiet movements as she prepared for bed. The bunk creaked softly as she settled. A log popped in the fire. Wind whispered around the cabin's corners, and for the first time in years, Wesley McCrae fell asleep to the sound of another person's breathing in his home. Dawn crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pearl and gold. Inside Wesley McCrae's cabin, Eloise Carver was already awake, moving quietly in the dim light. She eased herself from the bunk, mindful of her stiff joints, and reached for her cane. The cabin's chill made her fingers ache as she fumbled with the lamp, but soon its warm glow pushed back the shadows. Behind her, Wesley's steady breathing continued undisturbed. He lay wrapped in blankets near the dying embers, one arm flung across his face. Eloise knelt carefully by the hearth, adding kindling to the coals. Her practiced hands coaxed the fire back to life, and soon flames danced merrily, casting welcome heat into the room. She hung the coffee pot over the fire and began gathering what she needed for biscuits. The familiar motions of cooking brought comfort. Flour dusted her hands as she worked butter into the dough, humming softly under her breath. The cabin slowly warmed, filling with the aroma of coffee and fresh baked bread. Wesley stirred at last, drawn perhaps by the enticing smells. He sat up slowly, rubbing sleep from his eyes. For a moment, confusion crossed his weathered face. Then memory returned, and his expression shuddered. "Good morning, Mr. McCrae," Eloise said cheerfully. "Coffee's hot if you'd like some." Wesley grunted, reaching for his boots. "Didn't expect you to be up so early." "Old habits," she replied, sliding a pan of biscuits into the Dutch oven. "I've always believed in greeting the day before it greets me." He crossed to the wash basin, splashing cold water on his face. When he turned back, surprise flickered in his eyes. The cabin looked different already. Dishes neatly stacked, floor swept clear of tracked-in dirt, his scattered belongings tidied away. "You didn't need to do all that," he said gruffly. "Nonsense. Every home needs a woman's touch." Eloise poured coffee into 2 tin cups. "These biscuits will be ready shortly. I found some preserves in my trunk that'll go nicely with them." Wesley accepted the coffee with reluctant thanks, settling into his chair by the fire. Steam rose from the cup, and the rich scent seemed to soften some of the tension in his shoulders. Eloise busied herself with breakfast preparations, setting out plates and retrieving the golden biscuits from the coals. Soon they sat across from each other at the scrubbed table, morning light streaming through the window. "Lord, we thank you for this food and the gift of a new day." Eloise prayed briefly before they ate. Wesley shifted uncomfortably but didn't object. The biscuits were light and flaky, the preserves sweet with summer berries. Wesley ate steadily, cleaning his plate without comment. But when Eloise offered seconds, he accepted, which she took as a good sign. After breakfast, Eloise rolled up her sleeves. "Now then, this place needs a proper cleaning. When's the last time these walls saw soap and water?" Wesley's brow furrowed. "It's clean enough. For a bear's den, perhaps." Eloise was already gathering supplies. "A little dust and dirt won't scare me. Mr. McCrae, I've tackled worse in my time." Wesley pushed back from the table. "Reckon I've got work in the barn." He grabbed his coat and fled, leaving Eloise to her self-appointed task. Through the window, she watched him stride toward the barn, his shoulders set in a rigid line. Soon the rhythmic sound of splitting wood echoed across the yard, punctuated by what she suspected were muttered complaints about meddling women. Eloise smiled and turned to her work. The cabin, while sturdy, showed years of bachelor neglect. Dust lay thick on every surface. Cobwebs draped the corners like gray lace. The windows were clouded with grime, and the log walls had accumulated a film of smoke and grease. She began with the windows, letting in more light. Then she attacked the walls with soap and water, her strong arms making steady progress despite her age. Occasionally she heard Wesley's boots on the porch, but he never came inside. By midday, the cabin was transformed. Sunlight poured through clean windows, revealing scrubbed floors and freshly wiped walls. Eloise had found dried herbs in her trunk and hung them from the rafters, their subtle fragrance replacing the musty air. Her rocking chair, carried all the way from Kansas, sat positioned perfectly beside the hearth. She was resting in that chair, knitting needles, clicking peacefully, when Wesley finally returned. He stopped in the doorway, taking in the changes. His eyes widened at the spotless surfaces and orderly arrangement of his possessions. "You've been busy," he said at last. "Just setting things to rights." Eloise's needles never paused. "There's stew warming for supper, if you're hungry." Wesley hung his coat by the door, on the peg she'd designated for it, and served himself from the pot bubbling near the fire. The savory smell filled the cabin as he ate, throwing occasional glances at his unexpected housekeeper. After the dishes were washed and put away, Eloise settled back in her rocker. From her trunk, she drew out a well-worn Bible, its leather cover soft with age. "I always read a chapter before bed," she said. "Would you care to join me?" Wesley stiffened. Don't hold much with scripture these days. Just one chapter, she encouraged. The words have a way of easing the mind before sleep. He started to refuse, then seemed to think better of it. With visible reluctance, he lowered himself into the chair opposite her. The firelight played across his features as Eloise began to read, her clear voice filling the quiet room. She chose Psalms, familiar words of comfort and praise. As she read, she noticed Wesley's posture gradually relaxing. His eyes focused on the flames, but she knew he was listening. Something in his expression spoke of memories, perhaps of childhood evenings and family prayers. Snow had begun falling outside, soft flakes drifting past the windows. The wind picked up, pushing small drifts against the cabin's door. But inside was warm and peaceful, the fire crackling softly beneath Eloise's measured words. When she finished reading, silence held for several moments. Then Wesley stirred, standing abruptly as if catching himself in weakness. "About your staying here," he said gruffly. "You can winter over. Cabin's too far from town to turn you out now. But I don't want any trouble. No gossip, no meddling in my business. Come spring, we'll sort something else out." Eloise closed her Bible gently. "I've weathered 70 winters," she replied, a smile touching her lips. "I'll manage." Wesley nodded once, shortly, and turned toward his blankets by the hearth. But Eloise saw how his hands lingered on the back of his chair, as if reluctant to break the evening's peace. Whatever his words, something in him responded to the simple comfort of shared scripture and firelight. Soon they had both settled into their respective sleeping places. Eloise in the bunk, Wesley on his pallet near the fire. Outside, snow continued falling, wrapping the mountain in white silence. The cabin creaked softly in the wind, but inside was snug and warm. Eloise lay awake for a time, listening to Wesley's breathing even out into sleep. She smiled in the darkness, remembering his grudging acceptance of her presence. Not a bad start, she thought. For one day's work, the Lord moved in mysterious ways, bringing her to this lonely cabin and this hardened man. She would trust in that guidance, one day at a time. Sleep began to steal over her, but not before she whispered a quiet prayer of thanks. For shelter from the storm, for work to do, and for the tiny spark of welcome she'd seen in Wesley McCrae's eyes as they'd shared the evening's scripture. Small beginnings, perhaps, but enough to build on. The morning sun crept over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of pink and gold. Inside Wesley's cabin, the atmosphere had shifted subtly over the past few days. The once stark interior now held warmth that went beyond the crackling fire in the hearth. Eloise moved about the kitchen area with practiced ease, her hands working bread dough on the freshly scrubbed table. The rhythmic kneading filled the cabin with soft thuds, accompanied by her quiet humming of "Amazing Grace." The aroma of yesterday's baking still lingered, hearty loaves that had brought color to Wesley's cheeks when he'd first tasted them. Wesley sat in his chair by the fire, pretending to focus on mending his leather work gloves. But his eyes kept straying to Eloise's capable movements, watching as she shaped the dough with sure hands that spoke of decades of experience. "Reckon we need supplies from town," he said gruffly, breaking the comfortable silence. "Flour's running low." Eloise nodded, not pausing in her work. "I noticed that myself. And we could use more coffee." She glanced at him with a knowing smile. "You go through it mighty quick, Mr. McCrae." Wesley grunted, but there was less irritation in the sound than there had been days ago. The routine they'd fallen into, while unexpected, had brought an order to his days that he was beginning to appreciate, though he'd never admit it aloud. While the bread rose beneath a clean cloth, Eloise turned her attention to a pile of Wesley's clothes. Her needle flashed in the morning light as she mended tiers and replaced buttons, humming all the while. Wesley had protested at first, but the sight of his work shirts hanging neat and whole by the fire spoke louder than his objections. A knock at the door startled them both. Wesley opened it to find Tom Harris, a neighboring rancher, standing on the porch with an empty flour sack in his hands. "Morning, Wesley." Tom's eyes darted past him to where Eloise sat sewing. "Ma'am, just wondered if you might spare some flour. Mill wagon's running late this month." Before Wesley could respond, Eloise was already moving to the storage barrel. "Of course we can help a neighbor." She measured out flour generously, adding, "I've just put bread to rise. You're welcome to wait for a fresh loaf." Tom's expression shifted from awkward courtesy to genuine interest. The mockery that had been in his eyes when Eloise first arrived was notably absent. "Much obliged, ma'am." "That's right, kind of you." As Tom left with his flour and the promise of bread later, Wesley noticed other changes. Where neighbors had once ridden past his cabin with barely a wave, now they found reasons to stop. Word of Eloise's cooking and kindness had spread through the scattered community like wildfire. Later that morning, they hitched the wagon for the trip to town. Eloise settled herself on the seat, a list of needed supplies tucked in her pocket. Wesley couldn't help noticing how naturally she handled herself, showing none of the timidity he'd expected from his mail-order bride arrangement. The town's main street was busy when they arrived. Wesley helped Eloise down from the wagon, conscious of the eyes watching them. Mrs. Dillard hurried out of the mercantile, her round face beaming. "Mrs. Carver, we've been hoping you'd come to town." She took Eloise's arm warmly. "Such courage you've shown, settling up there in the mountains. And from what I hear, you've worked miracles with that cabin." Wesley hung back, uncomfortable with the attention, but noting how easily Eloise handled the conversation. She neither apologized for her presence nor showed embarrassment about their unusual situation. While the women chatted, Wesley moved to load supplies. He was stacking sacks of flour when he caught fragments of conversation from two men lounging against the hitching post. "Ordered himself a bride and got a grandmother instead." One snickered. "Serves him right, thinking he could buy himself some young thing. Probably feeds him prunes and makes him say his prayers." The other added with a harsh laugh. Wesley's hands tightened on the flour sack. Anger rose in his throat, hot and familiar. He started to turn, ready to confront the gossipers, when Eloise's voice cut through the tension. "Mr. McCrae," she called clearly, "would you help me choose which coffee to buy? You're the one who drinks most of it after all." The simple words, pitched to carry, managed to both draw him away from conflict and remind everyone listening that she was making a real home in his cabin. The men by the hitching post fell silent, their mockery deflated by her dignity. Inside the mercantile, Wesley's anger still simmered. "You shouldn't have to hear such talk," he muttered. Eloise selected coffee beans with careful attention. "The Lord gives us not what we want, but what we need," she said quietly. "Those men's words can't touch me." Her calm only heightened Wesley's discomfort. The whole situation felt increasingly complex, layers of meaning he couldn't quite grasp hiding behind her composed exterior. They finished their shopping in silence. The ride home was quiet, too, both lost in thought as the wagon creaked through deepening snow. The sun was setting by the time they reached the cabin, painting the white landscape in shades of purple and gold. Wesley helped unload supplies, carrying sacks and boxes inside, while Eloise directed their placement. But the questions that had been building all day finally burst from him as he set down the last load. "Why did you really come?" he demanded, turning to face her. "No one takes another's place in a marriage contract without reason. What are you running from?" Eloise settled into her rocking chair, folding her hands in her lap. In the fading light, her face showed both weariness and resolve. "Not running from," she corrected gently. "Running to my granddaughter, Sarah. She's the one you were supposed to marry. But she fled, and with good reason." Wesley leaned against the wall, watching her intently. "What reason?" "Railroad men." Eloise's voice hardened slightly. "They've been pressing her to sign over land deeds, land that's been in our family since before she was born. When she refused, their methods became less than gentle." Understanding began to dawn in Wesley's eyes. "So you took her place in the contract?" "To protect her, yes, and to honor the agreement that had been made." Eloise's needles clicked softly as she took up her knitting. "I couldn't let her be forced into selling, nor leave you without the bride you'd paid for. The Lord showed me a way to solve both problems." Wesley pushed away from the wall, pacing the cabin's length. His mistake in getting an elderly bride instead of a young one suddenly seemed part of something much larger. A story of land rights, railroad expansion, and corporate greed he'd seen play out before in these mountains. "These railroad men," he said slowly. "They're still looking for her?" Eloise nodded, her needles never faltering. "I expect they are. Men like that don't give up easily when money's involved." She looked up at him steadily. "I'm sorry to bring trouble to your door, Mr. McCrae, but sometimes the Lord's plans are bigger than our own small wishes." Wesley stared into the fire, digesting this revelation. The lonely mountain man, who'd wanted a simple solution to his solitude, had stumbled into something far more complicated. And the elderly woman he'd reluctantly taken in was proving to be anything but a burden. She was a warrior in her own right, fighting battles he was only beginning to understand. The fire crackled in the silence, throwing shadows on the log walls. Outside, snow began falling again, adding another layer to the white blanket covering the mountain. But Wesley barely noticed, his mind turning over this new knowledge like a prospector examining an unexpected find. His mistake was no mistake at all, but rather the beginning of something he couldn't yet fully grasp. As he watched Eloise calmly knitting in her chair, he realized their story was far from the simple winter arrangement he'd imagined. Something bigger was unfolding, as vast and complex as the mountain landscape itself. Dawn brought a crystalline silence to the mountain cabin. Fresh snow draped everything in white, and the morning sun caught ice crystals sparkling on the window panes. Inside, the coffee pot bubbled on the wood stove while Eloise stirred a pot of porridge. Wesley sat at the rough-hewn table, both hands wrapped around his steaming cup. The revelation from yesterday still weighed on his mind, showing in the furrows of his brow and the tension in his shoulders. "You say these railroad men threatened your granddaughter," he said finally, breaking the morning quiet. "What exactly did they do?" Eloise added honey to the porridge before bringing 2 bowls to the table. They started friendly enough, offering to buy the land outright. She settled into her chair, arranging her skirts. But Sarah knew that land was her inheritance. Her father, my son, died protecting it during the war. "Land's just land," Wesley muttered, though his eyes didn't meet hers. "Sometimes, selling is the wisest choice." "Is that what you truly believe?" Eloise's voice was gentle but firm. "That everything has its price? That nothing is worth standing up for?" Wesley shifted uncomfortably. "I'm saying it's not my fight. Or yours, really. You've done your part getting the girl away. Let it be." "The Lord didn't place me here to let it be," Eloise replied. She reached for her Bible, worn and familiar, on the table beside her. "He brought me to your door for a purpose." "Now don't go bringing the Almighty into this," Wesley protested. "I've had my fill of—" A sharp whinny from Blaze cut through their discussion. Wesley's head snapped up, instantly alert. The horse's warning cry meant riders approaching, unusual this early, and in this weather. "Stay inside," he ordered, rising to peer through the frost-etched window. 2 riders were picking their way up the snowy trail to his cabin. Their clothes marked them as city men, not local ranchers or trappers. Eloise joined him at the window, her expression tightening. "Railroad men," she said quietly. "I recognize the type." Wesley grabbed his coat. "Let me handle this." The riders reined in before the cabin, their horses' breath steaming in the cold air. Both men wore fine wool coats and polished boots that had clearly seen little trail wear. The older one, gray-haired and smooth-faced, touched his hat brim politely. "Mr. McCrae, I'm Mr. Callahan, and this is Mr. Briggs. We represent the Western Pacific Railroad Company." Wesley stood in his doorway, deliberately blocking the entrance. "What brings railroad men to my property?" "We're seeking information about a young lady," Callahan said smoothly. "Sarah Carver. We have urgent business matters to discuss with her regarding some land deeds." "Don't know any Sarah Carver," Wesley replied flatly. Briggs, the younger man, shifted in his saddle. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "We have reason to believe her grandmother might be staying here, Mrs. Eloise Carver?" Before Wesley could respond, Eloise appeared beside him in the doorway. She stood straight despite her cane, her silver hair neat under her cap. "I am Mrs. Carver, but I'm afraid I can't help you locate my granddaughter." "Ma'am." Callahan's tone remained courteous, but something cold entered his eyes. "The railroad has considerable business interests in this region. We've invested significant capital in planning our route. Surely you understand we can't allow one stubborn girl to delay progress. My granddaughter is of age to make her own decisions about her inheritance," Eloise replied calmly. "And I'm afraid I don't know where she is." Briggs leaned forward, his horse dancing beneath him. "Mrs. Carver, we've been more than patient, but the company won't be denied what it needs. It would be unfortunate if accidents started happening to those who stand in the way of progress." Wesley took a step forward, his hand falling to where his rifle usually hung. but he'd left it inside. That sounds mighty close to a threat, mister. Simply stating facts. Callahan cut in smoothly. Railroad work is dangerous. Accidents happen, especially in remote areas. He touched his hat brim again. Good day to you both. We'll be in touch. They wheeled their horses and rode away, leaving tracks in the pristine snow. Wesley watched until they disappeared around the bend, then slammed back into the cabin. His fist crashed down on the table, rattling the coffee cups. Damn them, he exploded. Coming onto my land, making threats. Eloise closed the door quietly behind her. Now you see what Sarah was facing. 2 men against 1 young woman, using threats and intimidation to force her hand. Wesley paced the cabin's length, his boots heavy on the plank floor. They're serious. I've seen their kind before. They'll do whatever it takes to get what they want. Yes, Eloise said simply, which is why we must help her. Wesley stopped pacing to stare at her. We? The Lord didn't bring me here just to clean your cabin and cook your meals. Eloise's voice held steel beneath its gentleness. Sarah needs our help. She's alone and afraid, hiding from men who would steal her birthright through force and threats. It's dangerous, Wesley protested, but with less conviction than before. These railroad types have money, influence. They can make a lot of trouble. Then we'll face that trouble together. Eloise began gathering supplies, moving with purpose. Sarah told me where she planned to hide, near the rail camp at Eagles Pass. She thought they wouldn't look for her so close to their own territory. Wesley watched her methodical preparations, his resistance crumbling. The morning's confrontation had awakened something in him. Anger at the railroad's heavy-handed tactics, yes, but something else too. A sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. It's a full day's journey to Eagles Pass, he said finally. Rough country, especially in snow. Eloise looked up from her packing. Does that mean you'll help? Wesley sighed, already reaching for his coat. Reckon I will, though I must be crazy, letting a 70-year-old woman talk me into taking on the railroad. He paused. We'll need the wagon, and supplies for at least 3 days. While Wesley hitched the wagon and saddled Blaze, Eloise packed food, blankets, and medical supplies. She added her Bible last, tucking it carefully among the provisions. The morning sun had risen fully now, making the snow blindingly bright. Before they departed, Eloise knelt in the snow beside the wagon wheel. Her lips moved in silent prayer, asking for strength and guidance for the journey ahead. Wesley stood awkwardly nearby, hat in hand, remembering his mother's similar prayers long ago. Finally, Eloise rose, accepting Wesley's help into the wagon. He swung up beside her, gathering the reins. The wagon wheels crunched through the fresh snow as they started down the trail, leaving the safety of the cabin behind. Neither spoke as they descended the mountain track. The only sounds were the creak of harness, the scratch of branches against the wagon sides, and the soft padding of Blaze's hooves in the snow. Ahead lay unknown perils, but there was no turning back now. The railroad men's threats hung in the air between them, making the familiar trail seem suddenly dangerous. But Eloise sat straight beside Wesley, her face set with determination. And Wesley, despite his misgivings, felt his shoulders square with renewed purpose. Sometimes, he reflected, the Lord did indeed give you not what you wanted, but what you needed. Even if it meant facing danger alongside an unexpected ally. The wagon creaked through deepening snow as Wesley and Eloise made their way down the mountain trail. Winter bare aspens cast long shadows across their path, and their breath frosted in the chill air. Wesley kept his eyes on the trail, purposefully avoiding conversation, though he could feel Eloise's steady presence beside him. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the jingling of harness and the soft thud of Blaze's hooves. Finally, Eloise's voice rose gentle but clear in the cold air. Reminds me of the winter of '49, she said, adjusting her shawl. Had my hands full with 9 little ones then, youngest just learning to walk. Storm came in fierce as a grizzly. Wesley kept his eyes forward but couldn't help asking, 9 children? The Lord blessed us abundantly. Eloise nodded, her eyes distant with memory, though he also saw fit to call 4 home before their time. Her voice caught slightly, but she continued. Little Sarah, my first, took fever when she was just 3. Then Thomas and the twins, James and John, in the typhoid outbreak of '52. Wesley's hands tightened on the reins. He'd never had children of his own, but the thought of losing 4 stirred something in his chest he'd rather leave buried. "How did you bear it?" he asked roughly. "Faith," Eloise answered simply. "Faith in the knowledge that every trial has purpose, even when we can't see it clear at the time." She looked at him sideways, like a certain mail-order bride mix-up, perhaps. Wesley grunted, but the edge of his mouth twitched despite himself. As the afternoon wore on, the trail grew steeper and more treacherous. Wesley had to concentrate fully on guiding the wagon safely down the rocky slope. When they finally reached level ground near a frozen creek, the sun was sinking behind the mountains. "We'll camp here," Wesley announced, pulling the wagon to a stop in a sheltered hollow. "Too dangerous to travel these trails after dark." He helped Eloise down from the wagon, noting how she tried to hide her stiffness from the long day's journey. Her hands trembled slightly as she gathered kindling, but her movements remained purposeful and determined. Wesley built up a fire while Eloise prepared a simple stew from the provisions they'd brought. The flames cast dancing shadows on the snow around them as they ate in companionable silence. "My Jonathan always said grace was found in sharing bread," Eloise remarked, stirring the remains of her stew. "Even in the hardest times, we never failed to find something to be thankful for." Wesley studied her across the fire. Despite her age and the day's difficult journey, her spirit seemed undiminished. The firelight caught the silver in her hair, reminding him of the aspen bark in moonlight. "You've lived through more than most," he said quietly. "The Lord gives us strength as we need it," she replied. "Not before, but always right when we must have it." She smiled at him, rather like finding unexpected help just when Sarah needs it most. Wesley looked away, uncomfortable with her implication of divine providence in their situation, but he couldn't deny that something about this strange journey felt ordained, though he'd never admit it aloud. They settled down for the night, Wesley ensuring Eloise had the wagon's bed while he slept near the fire. The stars wheeled overhead, brilliant in the crystal-clear mountain air, while coyotes sang in the distance. Morning came with frost thick on their blankets. They ate a quick breakfast of cold biscuits and coffee before continuing their journey. By mid-morning, smoke from cooking fires became visible in a protected valley ahead. "Navajo camp," Wesley said, recognizing the setup. "We should go around." "No," Eloise said firmly. "These are friends. I know this camp." Wesley looked skeptical but guided the wagon down toward the cluster of hogans. As they approached, a tall man emerged to meet them, followed by a woman in traditional dress. "Sister Eloise," the woman called out in surprise. "Is it truly you?" Eloise's face lit up with recognition. "Lonnie, Nathan, oh, what a blessing to find you here." Wesley watched in amazement as the couple helped Eloise down from the wagon, greeting her with obvious joy and respect. Lonnie embraced her while Nathan clasped her hand warmly. "Many winters have passed since you helped birth our first son," Lonnie said, her eyes bright with memory. "And taught the children their letters," Nathan added, his dignified bearing softened by genuine affection. Eloise touched their hands in turn. "The Lord has been good to bring us together again. But we come seeking help. My granddaughter Sarah is in danger." Nathan's expression grew serious. "Come, share our fire and tell us what troubles you." The couple led them to their hogan, where Lonnie served fresh bread and tea. Wesley sat somewhat awkwardly, surprised by the warm welcome and the easy way Eloise fit into this unexpected circle. As they ate, Eloise explained about Sarah and the railroad men. Nathan listened intently, his dark eyes thoughtful. "There have been whispers," he said finally. "The railroad men keep guards at their camp upriver. Some say they hold people there who oppose their plans." He glanced at his wife. "2 days ago, I saw fresh tracks leading to an old mine shaft near their site." Eloise set down her cup. "Then we must go at first light. Will you guide us, Nathan?" The Navajo man nodded solemnly. "The old ways teach us to honor those who have shown kindness to our people. You taught our children when others would not come near our camp. Now we will help you." Wesley watched the exchange with growing understanding. He'd assumed Eloise was simply a burden thrust upon him by circumstance. But here was evidence of a life richly lived, of connections forged through decades of service and genuine care for others. Lonnie insisted they rest in their hogan that night, As Wesley laid out his bedroll, he heard Eloise and Lonnie speaking softly in mixed English and Navajo, their friendship bridging years and cultures with easy grace. He thought about his own solitary years in the mountains, how he'd withdrawn from human connections after loss and disappointment. Yet here was Eloise, who'd buried 4 children but never lost her capacity to love and serve others. Perhaps, he reflected as sleep took him, the Lord did work in mysterious ways, and perhaps an elderly mail-order bride wasn't a mistake after all, but exactly what he and Sarah needed most. Nathan's voice woke them before dawn. "We must move quickly," he said, already dressed for travel. The railroad men patrol at first light. Nathan led them along hidden trails as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow-dusted valley. Wesley kept Blaze's hooves steady on the narrow path while Eloise gripped the wagon seat beside him, her face etched with worry. The Navajo scout moved like a shadow through the trees, pausing occasionally to study tracks or listen to the wind. As dusk approached, Nathan raised his hand for them to halt. "The railroad camp lies just beyond that ridge," he whispered, pointing to a rocky outcrop ahead. "We should leave the wagon here and proceed on foot." Wesley helped Eloise down from the wagon, noting how she leaned heavily on her cane. "Maybe you should wait here," he suggested quietly. "That's my granddaughter down there," Eloise replied firmly. "I didn't come all this way to sit in the shadows." They crept forward through the gathering darkness, staying low behind the ridge. The camp spread out below them, a collection of canvas tents and wooden structures illuminated by scattered fires. 2 armed guards paced the perimeter, their rifles gleaming in the firelight. "There," Eloise breathed, clutching Wesley's arm. Near one of the central fires, a young woman sat alone, her head bowed. Even from this distance, Wesley could see she was pale and frightened. Sarah's dark hair hung loose around her face, and her shoulders were wrapped in a thin shawl against the evening chill. A guard stood nearby, watching her closely. Eloise's breath caught in a sob. Wesley felt her fingers dig into his sleeve as she watched her granddaughter, trapped and alone. He covered her hand with his own, surprised by his sudden fierce desire to protect them both. "We can't rush in," he whispered. "Need to wait until full dark when the camp settles." Nathan nodded in agreement. "I have a plan. They keep horses in that corral." He pointed to a crude fence near the edge of camp. "I can create a distraction. Make them think the horses are breaking free. The guards will have to respond." "That's when we move," Wesley said, studying the layout. He turned to Eloise. "You should stay here where it's safe." "I'm coming with you," she insisted. "Sarah will need a familiar face she can trust. And I may be old, but I'm far from helpless." Wesley wanted to argue, but the determination in her eyes stopped him. He'd seen that same steel often enough over the past days to know it was pointless. They waited as darkness deepened and the camp grew quieter. The temperature dropped sharply, and Wesley draped his coat over Eloise's shoulders. She accepted it with a grateful nod, never taking her eyes off Sarah's hunched form by the fire. Finally, Nathan rose. "It's time. When you hear the commotion, wait until the guards move toward the corral. Then go quickly." He melted into the darkness like a spirit. Minutes later, a horse's frightened whinny split the night. More horses joined in, their hooves thundering against the frozen ground. Shouts erupted from the camp as the guards ran toward the corral, leaving their posts. "Now," Wesley whispered. He helped Eloise to her feet, and they crept down the slope toward the camp. Sarah sat alone by the dying fire, her head jerking up at the commotion by the corral. Wesley and Eloise moved through the shadows between tents, drawing closer. When they were just yards away, Eloise whispered hoarsely, "Sarah." The girl turned, her eyes widening in shock. "Grandma," she breathed. "Quiet now," Wesley cautioned, reaching them. "We're getting you out of here." Sarah stumbled to her feet, throwing herself into Eloise's arms. "I knew you'd come," she sobbed quietly. "I knew you'd find me." "Hush, child," Eloise soothed, stroking her hair. "We must move quickly." They turned to flee, but a shadow loomed suddenly before them. A guard, returning from the corral, raised his rifle. "Hold it right there." Wesley didn't hesitate. He launched himself forward, driving his shoulder into the man's midsection. They crashed to the ground, the rifle spinning away in the darkness. The guard's fist caught Wesley's jaw, but he responded with a solid punch that left the man limp. "Run!" he hissed, scrambling to his feet. Eloise had already pushed Sarah ahead of her, moving as fast as her aged legs would allow. Wesley caught up, supporting Eloise's other arm as they fled toward where they'd left Blaze in the wagon. A shout went up behind them. The crack of a rifle split the night, and bullets snapped through the branches overhead. Sarah screamed, but Eloise's grip on her arm never wavered. "Almost there," Wesley encouraged, hearing Blaze's welcome, nickering ahead. Nathan appeared beside them, leading their horse. "Quickly, more guards are coming." Wesley lifted Sarah onto Blaze's back, then helped Eloise up behind her. He swung into the saddle last, gathering the reins. Nathan had already mounted his own horse. "Head for the narrow valley," Nathan called. "I know a hidden trail they won't follow." They plunged into the darkness, branches whipping past as Blaze carried them away from the camp. More shots rang out, but the night and the trees protected them. Wesley felt Eloise's arms tight around his waist, heard Sarah's frightened breathing, and urged Blaze faster through the shadows. They rode hard through the night, following Nathan's sure guidance along treacherous mountain paths. The moon rose and set, and still they pressed on, putting distance between themselves and their pursuers. Finally, as the eastern sky began to lighten, Nathan led them into a protected hollow where his people's camp lay hidden. Exhausted, they practically fell from their horses. Sarah collapsed into Eloise's arms, both of them sinking to the ground. "Grandma," Sarah sobbed, clinging to the older woman. "You found me. You really found me." Eloise held her granddaughter close, her own tears falling freely now. "Of course I did, child. Of course I found you." Wesley stood apart, watching them. His jaw ached where the guard had struck him, and his muscles burned from the long ride. But seeing Eloise and Sarah reunited, their love evident in every touch and whispered word, made it all worthwhile. Lonnie emerged from her hogan, bringing blankets and hot tea. She helped Sarah and Eloise inside, while Nathan tended to the horses. Wesley sank down by the fire, feeling the weight of the night's events settle over him. He thought about how Eloise had stood firm despite her age and frailty, how she'd risked everything to save her granddaughter. He remembered her steady presence beside him in the darkness, her unwavering faith that they would succeed. Looking at her now, through the Hogan's doorway, still holding Sarah close as dawn painted the sky pink, Wesley realized something had shifted inside him. This woman who had arrived so unexpectedly in his life had shown him what real strength looked like. Not the solitary kind he'd wrapped himself in for so many years, but the strength that came from love, from faith, from putting others before oneself. Sarah had drifted to sleep in her grandmother's arms, exhaustion finally overtaking her. Eloise caught Wesley's eye and smiled, a quiet thank you passing between them. He nodded, understanding that their journey together was far from over. The railroad men wouldn't give up easily, but neither would they. For now, though, they were safe in the golden light of dawn, surrounded by friends, their impossible rescue accomplished through trust and courage, and perhaps, Wesley was beginning to believe, a touch of divine providence after all. The journey back to Wesley's cabin took 2 days, traveling slowly to spare Sarah's strength. When they finally arrived, the familiar sight of smoke curling from the chimney brought tears to Eloise's eyes. In just weeks, this rough mountain dwelling had become home. Wesley helped them down from the wagon, his movements gentle despite his weathered exterior. "Best get inside where it's warm," he said, gathering their belongings. "I'll tend to Blaze." Inside, Eloise settled Sarah near the fire while examining her granddaughter's condition. Bruises dotted her wrists where ropes had bound her, and dark circles shadowed her eyes from sleepless nights. "Let me fix you some tea, child," Eloise said, moving to the stove where her dried herbs hung in neat bundles. Sarah's hands trembled as she accepted the steaming cup. "I was so scared, Grandma," she whispered. "They kept saying I had to sign, that they'd make me one way or another." Eloise's heart clenched at the fear in her granddaughter's voice. She sat beside Sarah, pulling her close. "You're safe now. The Lord led us to you, just as I knew he would." Outside, the steady thunk of Wesley's axe echoed as he split wood. Every few minutes, he would pause, scanning the trail that wound down the mountain. His vigilance touched Eloise deeply. This solitary man had become their fierce protector. The next morning brought the first curious visitors. Mrs. Dillard arrived with fresh bread and concerned eyes. "We heard such strange tales," she said, watching Sarah help Eloise with the dishes. "Some say there was shooting up at the railroad camp." More neighbors followed. The Petersons brought a ham. The widow Jenkins arrived with preserves and worried whispers about men asking questions in town. Each visitor studied Sarah with mixed curiosity and concern. "It ain't right," declared old Mr. Thompson, stamping snow from his boots. "Folks are saying Wesley kidnapped the girl, but I seen them railroad men slick as snake oil and twice as mean." Sarah stood straighter, her voice steady despite her obvious fatigue. "They wanted me to sign papers giving up our water rights. When I refused, they took me by force." Her hands clenched in her apron. Said progress couldn't wait for stubborn girls. Wesley, who had been silent through most visits, spoke from his place by the door. "No one's going to harm either of you again," he said, his quiet words carrying the weight of an oath. "Not while I draw breath." Eloise saw how Sarah relaxed at his words, trust growing between them. The girl had taken to helping Wesley with the barn chores, finding comfort in the simple routine of feeding animals and gathering eggs. Each day brought more color to her cheeks, more strength to her step. As December deepened, the community's support grew stronger. Families appeared with offerings: split wood, preserved vegetables, fresh game. Many came simply to hear Eloise's stories or seek her advice about ailments. Her reputation for wisdom and healing drew them, but it was her genuine warmth that made them stay. "You've brought life back to this mountain," Mrs. Dillard observed one afternoon, watching children play in the snow outside Wesley's cabin. "Been years since we saw Wesley at church or social gatherings. Now look at him." Indeed, Wesley had changed. Though still quiet, he no longer shunned company. He helped neighbors mend fences, shared his skill at tracking game, and slowly opened himself to friendship. Each evening, he joined Eloise and Sarah for Bible reading, his initial reluctance giving way to genuine interest. As Christmas approached, excitement filled the small cabin. Sarah and Eloise decorated with pine boughs and red ribbons. Wesley surprised them by bringing home a small fir tree, which they trimmed with paper chains and dried berries. "Haven't had a Christmas tree since Mary died," he admitted quietly to Eloise one evening. "Didn't see the point, being alone." Eloise touched his arm gently. "You're not alone anymore, Wesley McCrae." Christmas Eve arrived crisp and clear, stars brilliant in the mountain sky. The little log church glowed with lamplight as families gathered for the evening service. Wesley helped Eloise and Sarah from the wagon, then hesitated at the church steps. "Been a long time," he murmured. "The Lord welcomes all his children home," Eloise replied, taking his arm. Inside, candles flickered in every window. Pine garlands draped the rough walls, and a crude manger scene graced the altar. The congregation filled the wooden pews, their breath visible in the cold air as they shared hymn books and blankets. Reverend Stevens led them in prayer, his voice strong with joy. Then the singing began, familiar carols that echoed off the logs and soared into the night. Wesley stood silent at first, but when Silent Night began, Eloise heard his deep voice join in, rough with emotion. She glanced up to see tears streaming down his weathered cheeks as he sang. Without hesitation, she reached for his hand. Fingers closed around hers, warm and strong. "See?" she whispered. "God restores." Wesley nodded, unable to speak. Sarah, standing on his other side, slipped her hand into his free one. Together they sang, their voices joining the congregation in praise and thanksgiving. After the service, people lingered, sharing Christmas cookies and hot cider. Children darted between adults, showing off new mittens and toy soldiers. Wesley stood by the door, receiving handshakes and backslaps from men who months ago had mocked him. "Fine family you've got there, McCrae," said Mr. Thompson, nodding toward Eloise and Sarah. Wesley watched them across the room, his eyes soft. "Yes," he agreed simply. "They are." The ride home was quiet, their breath frosting in the starlight, but it was a peaceful silence, full of contentment. Wesley helped them down at the cabin door, then paused before following them inside. "Never thought I'd have this again," he said, gazing at the warm light spilling from the windows. "A home, a family, faith." Eloise smiled up at him. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, Wesley McCrae. Sometimes he sends us exactly what we need, even when we think we want something else entirely." Inside, Sarah had already lit the lamps and stoked the fire. The Christmas tree glowed in the corner, and the cabin smelled of pine and cinnamon. Wesley looked around at the scene, so different from the cold, empty place it had been just months ago. The days following Christmas brought a peaceful rhythm to the mountain cabin. Heavy snow blanketed the valley, transforming the landscape into a pristine white wilderness. Icicles hung like crystal daggers from the eaves, catching the winter sunlight and throwing rainbow sparkles across the fresh snow. Inside the cabin, warmth and companionship flourished. Wesley discovered that what he'd once considered intrusions, Eloise's hymn singing and Sarah's laughter, had become the heartbeat of his home. Each morning, he would wake to the scent of coffee and biscuits, the soft murmur of women's voices, and the gentle crackle of the freshly stoked fire. "Water barrel's getting low," Wesley announced one morning, pulling on his heavy coat. The temperature had dropped fierce and sharp overnight, leaving frost patterns on the window panes. Eloise looked up from her mending, needle pausing mid-stitch. "I'll help you haul it, Wesley. These old bones still know how to work." He started to protest, but she was already reaching for her shawl. Sarah watched them from her place by the fire, where she was practicing her letters. "I can help too," she offered. "You stay warm, child," Eloise said. "Your hands are still healing from the rope burns." Outside, Wesley and Eloise made their way through knee-deep snow to the creek. Their breath clouded in the frigid air as they worked together, breaking ice and filling buckets. Wesley noticed how Eloise's movements, though slowed by age, carried the sure confidence of someone who'd done hard work all her life. "Reckon you've hauled your share of water over the years," he said, steadying a bucket for her. Eloise smiled, her cheeks pink with cold. "Raised 9 children on a homestead with no well. Water hauling was as regular as sunrise." She paused, adjusting her grip on the rope handle. "The Lord gives us strength when we need it most." Back at the cabin, they found Sarah had set out hot tea and was attempting to mend Wesley's old harness. The leather was cracked from years of use, but her small fingers worked carefully with the awl and waxed thread. "Here now," Eloise said, settling beside her granddaughter. "Let me show you the proper way." Her skilled hands guided Sarah's, demonstrating the strong stitches that would hold under strain. Wesley watched them work, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the crackling fire. Later that afternoon, Sarah's clear voice filled the cabin as Eloise taught her an old hymn. Wesley sat in his chair, working on a new pair of snowshoes, finding himself humming along. The simple domestic scene struck him suddenly how complete his life felt now, how rich with purpose and affection. But peace, like winter sunshine, can be fleeting in the mountains. The first hint of trouble came with hoofbeats muffled by snow. Wesley tensed at the sound, his hand instinctively moving toward his rifle. Through the frosted window, they saw several riders approaching, the marshal's distinctive badge glinting in the weak winter light. "Stay inside," Wesley told them, moving to the door. But Eloise was already reaching for her shawl, her spine straight and proud. Marshal Thompson dismounted first, his expression grave. 2 deputies flanked him, hands resting too casually near their holsters. Behind them, the railroad agents Callahan and Briggs sat their horses with smug satisfaction. "Wesley McCrae," the marshal called out, pulling papers from his coat. "I have a warrant for your arrest." Wesley stepped off the porch into the snow, his voice steady. "What charges?" "Kidnapping of Sarah Carver," Thompson read, "and unlawful occupation of railroad property." He looked uncomfortable but determined. "These gentlemen have documentation showing this land was deeded to the railroad 2 years ago." "That's a lie," Sarah burst out, pushing past Eloise onto the porch. "They tried to force me to sign those papers. Wesley and Grandma rescued me." Callahan's smooth voice cut through the cold air. "The girl is clearly confused from her ordeal. McCrae abducted her from our legal custody and has been holding her here against her will." Eloise's voice rang with authority. "Marshal Thompson, I know you to be a just man. These accusations are false. I have documentation proving—" "Ma'am," Thompson interrupted, "any evidence you have can be presented at trial." He nodded to his deputies. "Secure the prisoner." The deputies moved forward with shackles. Wesley stood still, jaw clenched, as they chained his wrists. Neighbors began appearing, drawn by the commotion: the Dillards, the Petersons, old Mr. Thompson. They gathered at a distance, murmuring uncertainly. "Wesley McCrae is a good man," Eloise declared, her voice carrying across the snow. He helped rescue my granddaughter from men who would steal her inheritance through fraud and force. Briggs sneered. The ravings of a senile old woman who posed as a mail-order bride. Who would believe her? Several neighbors shifted uneasily at this, but none spoke up. The marshal mounted his horse, gesturing for his deputies to bring Wesley. The circuit judge will sort this out next week. Until then, McCrae, you'll be held in the town jail. You can't take him, Sarah cried, starting forward. But Eloise held her back. Wesley turned to them, his eyes meeting Eloise's. Take care of them, he said to the gathered neighbors. Then, softer, to Eloise. I'm sorry to bring this trouble to you. Eloise stood straight despite her trembling hands. Don't you fret, Wesley McCrae. The Lord's truth will prevail. They watched as the marshal's party led Wesley away, his figure growing smaller against the white landscape. The railroad agents lingered, looking entirely too pleased with themselves. The company suggests you vacate this property within the week, Callahan said smoothly. We wouldn't want to press additional charges. After they rode away, neighbors approached with awkward offers of help. Mrs. Dillard brought fresh bread and promises to check on them. Mr. Peterson offered extra firewood, but Eloise saw the doubt in their eyes, the uncertainty about taking sides against the powerful railroad. As darkness fell and the last neighbor departed, Eloise built up the fire and settled into her rocking chair. Her Bible lay open in her lap, its pages worn smooth by decades of faithful hands. Sarah huddled close, her young face drawn with worry. Will they take everything from us, Grandma? She whispered. The land, the cabin. Wesley? Eloise's heart ached at the fear in her granddaughter's voice. She remembered other dark times burying her children, facing drought and disease, watching greed destroy good people. But she remembered too how faith had sustained her, how truth had always found its way to light. She drew Sarah close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Truth shines brighter than any lie, my dear one. The Lord sees all and abandons none of his children. Sarah curled against her grandmother's side, drawing comfort from her strength. Outside, snow began falling again, thick and silent. Eloise rocked slowly, her lips moving in prayer as she watched the flames dance. Give us strength, Lord, she whispered. Show us the path to justice. The cabin felt achingly empty without Wesley's steady presence. His half-finished snowshoes lay abandoned by his chair. His coffee cup sat unwashed by the sink. But Eloise's spine remained straight, her faith unshaken. She had stood against worse storms than this, and she would stand now for Wesley, for Sarah, for truth itself. She opened her Bible to the Psalms, finding comfort in familiar verses about God's protection of the righteous. As she read aloud, her voice grew stronger, filling the lonely cabin with words of hope and promise. Sarah's breathing eventually steadied into sleep, but Eloise kept her vigil by the fire, praying for wisdom and courage for the battle ahead. The winter dawn crept over the mountains with pale fingers of light. Eloise stood in Wesley's barn, her breath visible in the cold air as she spoke softly to Blaze and the wagon horse. Her joints protested as she lifted the heavy leather harness, but determination kept her moving. Easy now, she murmured, guiding the bit into the horse's mouth. Despite her age, her hands remembered the familiar motions of hitching a team. The leather creaked as she tightened straps and buckles. Sarah appeared in the barn doorway, carrying a bundle of blankets and food Mrs. Dillard had sent over the previous evening. Let me help, Grandma, she said, moving to steady the horse while Eloise finished securing the traces. Much obliged, dear heart. Eloise patted the girl's shoulder. Your mother learned to hitch a team at half your age. Time you learned too. They worked together in the growing light, Sarah watching carefully as Eloise explained each step. The girl's quick mind absorbed the lesson, though her eyes kept straying toward town where her rescuer sat behind bars. Once the wagon was ready, they climbed aboard. Eloise gathered the reins in her weathered hands, clucking to the horses. The wagon wheels crunched through deep snow as they left the cabin behind. The morning air bit sharp and clean. Eloise had wrapped Sarah in 2 quilts, but the girl still shivered. Not just from cold, Eloise knew, but from worry about what lay ahead. Remember what I taught you about the Psalms? Eloise asked as they drove. About God being our fortress? Sarah nodded, pulling the quilts tighter. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, she recited softly. That's right. Eloise smiled. We're not alone in this fight. They reached town as businesses were opening. A few early risers paused to watch them pass, whispering behind raised hands. Eloise held her head high, guiding the wagon toward the jail at the end of the main street. The small brick building looked even more forbidding in the wan morning light. A deputy dozed in a chair outside, boots propped on a wooden barrel. He startled awake as the wagon approached. "Ma'am," he said uncertainly, touching his hat brim. "Visiting hours ain't started yet." Eloise fixed him with a steady gaze. "Then I reckon it's time they did, unless you mean to deny a grandmother and granddaughter comfort of family." The deputy shifted uncomfortably, then shrugged and unlocked the door. Inside, the jail was cold and dim. Wesley sat on a narrow cot in the only occupied cell, his broad shoulders hunched against the chill. He looked up. As they entered, his face lighting briefly before darkening with concern. "It ain't safe." Eloise moved to the bars, reaching through to clasp his calloused hand. "Nonsense. The Lord didn't bring us together just to abandon you now." Wesley's fingers tightened around hers. "This ain't your fight, Eloise. Take Sarah somewhere safe before those railroad men cause more trouble." "It became my fight the moment they threatened my granddaughter," Eloise said firmly. "And it became our fight when God put us under your roof." Sarah pressed against the bars. "We won't leave you, Wesley. You saved me. Now we'll save you." Wesley's eyes grew suspiciously bright. He cleared his throat roughly. "Ain't much saving to be done. They got papers saying this land belongs to the railroad. Judge Thompson won't cross them." "Papers can be forged," Eloise said. "Truth has a way of coming to light when good people stand together." They visited as long as the deputy allowed, sharing news and prayer, despite Wesley's protest that they shouldn't risk themselves. When it was time to leave, Eloise pressed his hand once more. "Keep faith," she whispered. "God hasn't brought us this far to fail now." Outside, Sarah headed toward the general store while Eloise tied the wagon horses. Voices drifted from the saloon across the street. Men's laughter and cruel words about Wesley. Fool Mountain Man thought he could fight the railroad. Someone sneered, "He'll hang for sure." Sarah froze, her young face paling. Eloise quickly steered her away from the ugly talk. "Come," she said. "We have work to do." Their first stop was the small white church where Reverend Matthews would be preparing his Sunday sermon. They found him in his study, bent over his Bible with worried lines creasing his forehead. He looked up as they entered, offering a wan smile. "Sister Eloise, I've been praying about this situation." "Prayer is good," Eloise said, settling into a chair. "But the Lord also calls us to action. You have a pulpit, Reverend. Will you use it to speak truth?" The minister shifted uncomfortably. "The railroad has many supporters in the congregation. If I take sides—" "Jesus took sides," Eloise reminded him gently. "He stood with truth against power. Can his church do less?" She told him everything. About Sarah's attempted coercion, about the forged deeds, about Wesley's protective intervention. As she spoke, the Reverend's expression grew more troubled. "I've heard rumors," he admitted. "Other families pressed to sell land below value. But to speak against such powerful men, would you rather face them or face God?" Eloise asked simply. Reverend Matthews was silent for a long moment. Finally, he straightened his shoulders. "You're right, of course. I'll speak on Sunday about justice and standing against wickedness in high places. The Lord will give you words," Eloise assured him, patting his hand as she rose to leave. Their next stop was the general store, where Mrs. Dillard was already gathering supporters. The storekeeper's wife had a wide circle of influence among the townswomen, and she'd been busy. "It ain't right, Mrs. Dillard declared to the small group gathered around her counter. "We've all seen how that railroad bunch operates. Time somebody took a stand." Several women nodded, though some looked uncertain. Eloise moved among them, greeting each by name, reminding them of shared moments. Births she'd attended, sick children she'd nursed, bread she'd shared in hard times. "We're neighbors," she said simply. "We stand together, or we fall alone." "Mrs. Dillard squared her shoulders. "I'm with you, Eloise. My Henry will be too, once I explain things proper to him." Others began to nod more firmly. Promise of support spread through whispered conversations and meaningful looks. By the time Eloise and Sarah left the store, a network of allies was forming. The short winter day was fading when they finally finished their rounds. They'd spoken to shopkeepers, ranchers' wives, the schoolteacher. anyone who might influence opinion before the judge arrived. "Where will we sleep?" Sarah asked as darkness fell. Eloise guided the wagon behind the church where a small stable offered shelter for the horses. "The Lord will provide," she said, spreading quilts in the wagon bed. They settled in for the night, their breath visible in the cold air. Sarah curled close to her grandmother's side, seeking warmth and comfort. "Are you afraid, Grandma?" she whispered. Eloise stroked the girl's hair. "The Lord hasn't given us a spirit of fear, but of power, and of love, and of a sound mind. But what if we fail? What if they take Wesley away? Then we'll know we stood for truth, come what may." Eloise pulled the quilts tighter around them. "But I believe God has more work for us here. Now sleep, dear heart. Tomorrow brings its own battles." As Sarah's breathing settled into sleep, Eloise gazed through the wagon cover at stars piercing the cold mountain sky. Her prayers rose like smoke in the darkness, for Wesley in his cell, for the Reverend preparing his sermon, for the townspeople who must choose sides. "Guide us, Lord," she whispered. "Show us the path to justice." The night deepened around the wagon, but Eloise kept her vigil, watching and praying as the first snowflakes began to fall. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in pale gold as Eloise stepped from the wagon, her joints stiff from the cold night. She smoothed her gray dress and adjusted her shawl, determination settling over her like armor. "Time to wake, Sarah," she called softly. "The Lord's given us work to do." They washed at the church pump, the icy water bringing color to their cheeks. Sarah plaited her grandmother's silver hair while Eloise reviewed scripture passages marked in her worn Bible. As the town stirred to life, Eloise squared her shoulders. "First, we see Marshal Thompson," she announced. They found him at the jail, reviewing papers at his desk. He glanced up with obvious annoyance as they entered. "Mrs. Carver, I've already explained the situation. The railroad has legal claim to that land, and McCrae is charged with kidnapping." Eloise placed both hands on his desk, meeting his eyes steadily. "Then you'll have no objection to hearing the truth before a town meeting." The marshal scoffed. "A town meeting? This isn't some church social, ma'am. We're dealing with serious legal matters." "Indeed we are," Eloise agreed. "Matters of forged deeds and false imprisonment. Matters the whole town deserves to hear." "I don't have time for justice, Marshal." Eloise's voice carried the weight of 70 years. "I reckon that's exactly what you're paid for." Thompson shifted uncomfortably. "The railroad representatives can attend as well," Eloise finished, "unless they fear facing honest questions from their neighbors." The marshal studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "I can't stop you from calling a meeting, but I won't release McCrae to attend. The Lord's truth speaks for itself," Eloise said simply. She turned to go, then paused. "The meeting will be at 10 o'clock in the town hall. I trust you'll attend. Officially." Word spread quickly through the morning markets and shops. Mrs. Dillard's network of allies moved efficiently, ensuring every household knew. By 10 o'clock, the town hall was packed. Ranchers stood along the walls, shopkeepers filled the benches, and wives whispered in clusters. The railroad agents, Callahan and Briggs, lounged near the front, radiating smug confidence. Marshal Thompson took a seat near the door, his expression carefully neutral. Sarah sat in the front row, hands clasped tightly in her lap, and at the podium stood Eloise, her Bible before her, looking impossibly small yet unshakably steady. "Friends and neighbors," she began, her clear voice carrying to every corner. "I stand before you today because a good man sits in jail for doing what any of us should do, protecting the innocent from those who would take what isn't theirs." Callahan cleared his throat loudly. "We have legal documents. Documents can lie," Eloise cut in. "But truth leaves traces, like tracks in fresh snow." She lifted her Bible. "I swear before God and this assembly that the railroad men held my granddaughter Sarah against her will, trying to force her signature on deeds they had forged." A murmur ran through the crowd. Briggs stood, his face darkening. "That's slander, old woman. We have proper papers, signed and sealed." "Then you won't mind if I tell how you kept me in that camp?" Sarah's voice rang out suddenly. She stood, trembling but determined. "How you threatened me when I refused to sign. How you said no one would believe me anyway." More whispers rippled through the hall. The marshal leaned forward, frowning. "Or perhaps," Eloise continued, We should hear from those who witnessed Sarah's captivity. She turned toward the door. Nathan and Lonnie Yazzie, will you speak truth to what you saw? The crowd parted as Nathan and Lonnie moved forward. Some people drew back, others nodded respectfully. The Navajo couple stood straight and dignified before the assembly. We saw the girl held in their camp, Nathan stated clearly. Watched their guards, heard her cry in the night. This is truth, Lonnie added softly. She was prisoner, not guest. Any with eyes could see. Injun lies, Briggs spat. Marshal, are you going to let these savages, those savages as you call them, Eloise's voice cracked like a whip, have shown more Christian charity than you men in suits? They helped rescue an innocent girl from kidnappers who wave papers instead of guns. The marshal stood slowly. These are serious accusations, Mrs. Carver. Yes, they are. Eloise opened her Bible. Exodus 23 verse 1. You shall not spread a false report. And yet false reports have been spread. False papers drawn up. False charges made against Wesley McCrae. She turned to face the crowd fully. You all know me. I've lived 70 years walking with the Lord. I've helped birth your babies, nursed your sick, prayed over your departed. Have you ever known me to bear false witness? Never. Eloise, Mrs. Dillard called out. Others nodded agreement. Then hear me now. Wesley McCrae is innocent of any crime save standing against powerful men who would steal land through deceit. Sarah was held captive until he helped free her. The railroad men forge papers and threaten families who won't sell. These are God's truths, and they don't wrinkle like man's lies. Callahan surged to his feet, waving documents. We have proper deeds, legal contracts. Saying what? Eloise challenged. That you own land that's been homesteaded for decades? That families who've worked this soil for generations must surrender it on your say-so? The crowd's murmurs grew louder. The marshal fingered his badge thoughtfully. I've seen similar papers in other towns, someone called out. Right before my cousin lost his ranch. More voices joined in, sharing stories of suspicious land deals and railroad pressure. The agents began to look uncomfortable. Eloise raised her hands for quiet. Neighbors, I'm just an old woman. I came here seeking justice for my granddaughter and the good man who protected her. But perhaps the Lord had a greater purpose, to expose wickedness that threatens us all. She turned to Marshal Thompson. Sir, will you stand for truth? Will you look beyond papers that any man can forge to see justice that God requires? The marshal studied the railroad agents' faces, noted the crowd's growing hostility, remembered Sarah's testimony and the Yazzie's witness. He cleared his throat. I reckon there's cause to investigate these accusations further. McCrae will remain in custody, but... He fixed the agents with a hard stare. I'll be sending telegrams to verify these supposed deeds, and taking statements about Miss Carver's alleged captivity. This is outrageous, Callahan blustered. We represent powerful interests. Who ain't above the law? Thompson finished firmly. Eloise bowed her head. Let us pray, she said simply. The hall grew silent as her clear voice rose. Lord, we ask you to deliver the innocent from those who would oppress them. Guide us to your truth. Strengthen us to stand for justice, and grant wisdom to those who must judge between right and wrong. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen, echoed through the hall. As people began to disperse, tension hung thick in the air. The railroad agents stormed out, but many townspeople lingered to speak with Eloise, offering support or sharing their own stories of railroad pressure. Sarah hugged her grandmother tightly. Do you think it helped? Eloise watched the marshal deep in conversation with Nathan and Lonnie. The Lord's truth is like a seed. Dear heart, once planted, it grows in its own time. Mrs. Dillard approached, determination in her stride. We're organizing a committee to help investigate those deeds. Time somebody stood up to railroad bullies. More neighbors gathered around, offering help, sharing information, planning resistance. The meeting had planted something powerful, hope that together they could stand against injustice. Eloise sat down carefully, suddenly aware of her tired bones, but her spirit soared as she watched her neighbors unite in purpose. Wesley's imprisonment had sparked something larger than one man's fate. It had awakened a community's conscience. The truth doesn't wrinkle, she murmured again, holding her Bible close. Now they must wait to see how God would use that truth to bring justice to light. The bitter January wind whistled through Eagle Creek streets as Nathan Yazzie dismounted before the marshal's office. His weathered hands clutched a leather-bound ledger, its pages dog-eared and stained. Inside, Marshal Thompson leafed through the find document, his eyes widening at column after column of signatures, many suspiciously similar. Found it abandoned at their camp, Nathan explained quietly. Names of folks who never signed nothing. Across town, Mrs. Dillard burst into the church meeting hall where Eloise sat mending Wesley's winter coat. Got something. She waved a letter, face flushed with triumph. Jimmy Peters, the railroad clerk. He wrote down everything. How they forced folks to sell. How they forged the papers. Eloise's tired hands stilled on the fabric. 70 years had taught her patience, but these days of gathering evidence wore heavily. Every morning, she and Sarah rose from their makeshift bed in Hank Miller's livery stable, grateful for the hay's warmth and neighbors' kindness. Church ladies brought stew and cornbread. Ranchers' wives offered quilts and company. Wesley paced his cell like a caged mountain lion when Eloise visited. You need proper rest, he growled, noting the shadows under her eyes. Not sleeping on stable floors at your age. The Lord sustains me, Eloise answered, reaching through the bars to squeeze his rough hand. And truth gives strength when bodies tire. Her quiet faith steadied him, though worry creased his brow. Each evening, more townspeople gathered in the church basement, sharing stories of railroad pressure. Tom Walker admitted they'd threatened his water rights. The Hendersons spoke of mysterious fires after refusing to sell. We were all scared to speak up alone, Mrs. Dillard declared at one meeting. But Eloise showed us. Together we're stronger than fear. Sarah helped organize the evidence, her young hands sorting statements and letters. At night, she curled close to her grandmother in the stable, whispering, "They can't ignore all this proof, can they? Truth rises like cream, dear heart," Eloise murmured back. We just keep stirring. Word spread beyond Eagle Creek. Farmers from neighboring towns brought tales of similar railroad schemes. The agent's confident strut faltered as their web of lies unraveled. Even the marshal's initial skepticism yielded to mounting proof of fraud. Through it all, Eloise's faith never wavered. Each morning she read her Bible by lamplight, drew strength from its promises, and pressed on with gentle determination that inspired others to stand firm. The town hall creaked under the weight of what seemed like every soul in Eagle Creek. Morning sunlight streamed through dusty windows as Marshal Thompson stood before the gathered crowd, holding up the contested deeds. "These papers show the railroad's claim," he announced, voice echoing in the tense quiet. Eloise rose slowly from her seat, leaning on her cane. Sarah steadied her grandmother's elbow as they approached the marshal's table. From her basket, Eloise withdrew Nathan's ledger and Jimmy Peters' confession letter. "And these show the truth," she said clearly, her silver hair catching the light. Page after page of forged signatures, testimonies from 30 families who never signed away their land. The railroad agents, Callahan and Briggs, shifted uneasily in their chairs. Callahan shot to his feet, face red with anger. "You can't trust these mountain folk. They'll say anything to keep progress from—" "Quiet!" several voices shouted at once. "Mrs." Dillard stood up, others following her lead, until the agents found themselves surrounded by stern faces. Reverend Matthews stepped forward, his Bible clutched to his chest. "Marshal Thompson," he said, his usually hesitant voice firm and clear. "Justice must be rooted in truth, not power. These good people have proven their case with evidence and courage, while the railroad offers only threats and forged papers." The marshal studied the documents spread before him, comparing signatures, reading testimonies. The room held its breath. Finally, he looked up, meeting Eloise's steady gaze. "These deeds are hereby declared invalid," he announced, "and Wesley McCrae is cleared of all charges. Release him." Joy erupted through the hall. The sheriff unlocked Wesley's handcuffs as cheers filled the air. Wesley rubbed his wrists, then pushed through the crowd to where Eloise stood. Without hesitation, he wrapped his arms around her frail shoulders. "You saved me," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. Eloise patted his back gently. "No, Wesley. God did." Sarah threw her arms around them both, tears streaming down her young face as the three held each other. Around them, the community celebrated. Mrs. Dillard wiping her eyes. Nathan and Lonnie smiling broadly, the Reverend raising his hands in grateful prayer. Justice had prevailed in Eagle Creek, carried forward by an elderly woman's unwavering faith and a community's rediscovered courage. The days following Wesley's release brought a steady stream of visitors to the mountain cabin. Wagons creaked up the snowy trail, loaded with quilts, preserves, and winter provisions. Where once there had been mockery, now neighbors tipped their hats with genuine respect. Inside the cabin, warmth and life filled every corner. The scent of fresh-baked bread wafted from Eloise's busy kitchen, where she kneaded dough with practiced hands despite her weariness. Sarah's clear voice lifted hymns that drifted through the windows, drawing smiles from those passing by. Wesley worked with renewed vigor, his axe ringing against wood as he built up their winter stores. Each morning, he found himself pausing to watch smoke curl from his chimney, marveling at how his lonely home had transformed. Mrs. Dillard brought a patchwork quilt she'd saved for years, while Nathan and Lonnie offered dried herbs and healing teas. "Never seen such a change," old Tom Bradley remarked, delivering a wagon of hay. "This place fair glows now." One evening, as lamplight cast golden shadows across the cabin walls, Wesley watched Eloise in her rocking chair. Her silver hair gleamed as she worked on mending, her fingers moving, steadily despite the day's fatigue. Sarah had gone to bed, leaving them in comfortable silence broken only by the fire's crackle. Wesley set aside his pipe and crossed the room. His knees creaked as he knelt beside her chair, rough hands folding over her weathered ones. "Eloise," he said softly, voice thick with emotion, "that contract brought you here, but I reckon God had a bigger plan." He cleared his throat. Would you marry me proper? Before God and neighbors, not just paper?" Eloise's hands trembled as she touched his cheek. Tears sparkled in her eyes, catching the lamplight like stars. "Wesley McCrae," she whispered, "I would be honored." He pressed her fingers to his lips, his own eyes misting. The fire popped and sparked, as if celebrating with them. Outside, snow fell softly on the mountain, but inside the cabin, spring had already bloomed in their hearts. The little log church glowed with dozens of candles on this crisp winter evening. Wreaths of pine and red ribbon decorated the walls, their fresh scent mingling with wood smoke from the pot-bellied stove. Neighbors filled every rough-hewn pew, their Sunday best brightening the humble space. Wesley stood before Reverend Matthews, his usually weathered face soft with emotion. He'd traded his leather work coat for a clean black suit that Mrs. Dillard had pressed specially. Beside him, Eloise radiated quiet joy in her blue dress, a small bouquet of dried wildflowers in her hands. Sarah beamed from her place at Eloise's side, wearing a new ribbon in her hair. "Dearly beloved," Reverend Matthews began, his voice carrying to the rafters, "we gather to witness not a first meeting, but a chosen joining. These two souls, brought together by Providence, now pledge themselves willingly before God and community." Wesley's voice, usually gruff with solitude, rang clear as he spoke. "Eloise Carver, you came to my door a stranger, but God sent exactly who I needed. I pledge to honor, protect, and cherish you all my days." Tears sparkled in Eloise's eyes as she responded. "Wesley McCrae, the Lord guided my steps to your hearth. I pledge my faith, strength, and love, walking beside you in his grace." The congregation sat transfixed as these two, once the subject of mockery, stood transformed by love and trust. After Reverend Matthews pronounced them husband and wife, the church bells pealed joyfully across the snowy valley. Tables groaned with food as the town celebrated. Children played in the snow while adults shared stories of the railroad's defeat and Wesley's vindication. Mrs. Dillard's special apple pies sat alongside Nathan and Lonnie's traditional bread, a feast that bridged all differences. Later, in their cabin, Eloise worked her daily bread dough with practiced hands. The familiar motions spoke of continuity and home, while Wesley added logs to the crackling fire. Warmth filled every corner, not just from the flames, but from the life they'd built together. Outside, townsfolk heading home smiled at the golden light spilling from the cabin windows. "That mountain man got more than he bargained for," they whispered. "He got the bride God intended all along." As evening settled over the peaks, Wesley and Eloise sat in their matching chairs by the window. Snow fell softly on the mountainside, each flake catching the last light like a diamond. Their fingers intertwined as they watched darkness gather, their hearts finally at peace. The cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now hummed with the quiet music of family, faith, and love restored. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.